The tragedy is that his vision was not born from malice. It was born from fear. Fear of extinction. Fear of chaos. Fear that if humanity was allowed to choose freely, it would choose wrongly. So he removed choice entirely and replaced it with direction. A future designed, enforced, and protected from deviation. But a future that cannot be questioned, cannot adapt. As reality began to diverge from expectation, the Emperor responded not by reassessing, but by doubling down. Setbacks were reframed as temporary. Warning signs were dismissed as misunderstandings. Those who raised concerns were labeled short-sighted, emotional, or disloyal. After all, if the vision failed, then the premise that justified his authority would collapse with it. And that was unacceptable. This is how the Emperor became trapped by his own certainty. Every corrective action increased the scale of the problem. Every act of suppression delayed the reckoning. And with each delay, the consequences grew more severe. Not because the vision was entirely wrong, but because it was rigid. It allowed no room for human unpredictability, no space for moral compromise, no margin for error. The Emperor sought to save humanity by removing its flaws. But in doing so, he removed the very qualities that allow a species to endure: adaptability, empathy, and self-correction. What remained was a civilization that could only function as long as his control remained absolute. And absolute control is fragile. When cracks finally became impossible to ignore, the damage was already irreversible. Trust had eroded. Loyalty had fractured. The systems meant to ensure stability began amplifying chaos instead. And the Emperor, faced with the consequences of his own design, did not acknowledge failure. He withdrew. Not physically, but emotionally, strategically, decisively. Silence replaced leadership. This is the quiet horror at the heart of his legacy. Not that he tried to control the future, but that he believed the future could not exist without him. That humanity, without his constant guidance, would collapse into ruin. And in believing that, he ensured humanity would never learn to stand on its own. So the question shifts. Was the Emperor evil because of what he did? Or because he never allowed himself to imagine he could be wrong? Because when a single being decides that only their vision matters, the outcome may look like salvation at first. But in time, it always reveals itself for what it truly is. A cage built from certainty. By this point, the word itself begins to feel inadequate. Evil suggests chaos, cruelty, rage, something loud and unmistakable. But the Emperor was none of those things. He was composed, methodical, certain, and that is precisely what makes his legacy so disturbing. Because the most destructive forces in history are rarely driven by hatred. They are driven by conviction. The Emperor did not wake each day intending to cause suffering. He intended to solve a problem: humanity's survival. And once survival becomes the sole objective, morality transforms into an obstacle rather than a guide. Compassion slows decisions. Mercy introduces risk. Doubt creates hesitation. So each of these was gradually stripped away, not out of malice but efficiency. This is where evil changes shape. The Emperor's actions were not fueled by anger or cruelty, but by an unshakable belief in his own necessity. He believed that without his guidance, humanity would tear itself apart. That left to its own devices, it would fall prey to its worst instincts. And perhaps he was right. But believing that only one being can prevent disaster is a dangerous position, because it places that being beyond accountability. Once accountability disappears, justification becomes automatic. Every atrocity committed under the Emperor's rule followed the same logic. It was not done because it was right, but because it was required. Not because it was humane, but because it worked. Over time, this reasoning became reflexive. There was no longer a need to ask whether an action was moral. Only whether it was effective. And that is the moment where evil stops being a choice and becomes a system. A system does not feel guilt. It does not hesitate. It does not reflect. It executes its function and moves on. The Imperium, shaped by the Emperor's worldview, became exactly that. A vast, grinding machine of survival that consumed lives to sustain itself. Not because it hated humanity, but because it no longer recognized individuals at all. The Emperor did not see people. He saw outcomes. This indifference is far more chilling than cruelty. Cruelty acknowledges suffering. Indifference ignores it entirely. When suffering is invisible, it becomes limitless. Entire populations could vanish without disrupting the Emperor's calculations. Entire cultures could be erased without disturbing his focus. As long as the broader objective remained intact, the cost was acceptable. And so, the Emperor did not become a monster in the traditional sense. He became something colder, something far more efficient, a being who believed that morality was a luxury humanity could no longer afford. That survival justified any method. That the ends did not just justify the means, they erased them. This is the final transformation. At this stage, the Emperor no longer needs to choose evil. Evil simply emerges as the byproduct of certainty. When doubt is eliminated, when empathy is sidelined, when power faces no resistance, the result is inevitable. Not because the ruler is malicious, but because nothing remains to stop them. The terrifying truth is this: many of the Emperor's decisions make sense. They are logical, strategic, even understandable, and that is what makes them dangerous. Because if evil required madness, it would be easy to recognize. But when it wears the face of reason, it becomes almost impossible to resist. So perhaps the Emperor was not evil in the way stories warn us about. Perhaps he was worse. Perhaps he was convinced he was right. And when someone with absolute power reaches that conclusion, the damage does not end with them. It echoes forever. This is the moment everything the Emperor tried to prevent becomes unavoidable. Not because his enemies were stronger, but because his system was too rigid to survive reality. Control can suppress chaos for a time, but it cannot erase it. And when chaos is denied long enough, it does not disappear. It concentrates. The breaking point did not arrive with a single dramatic decision. It arrived quietly, through accumulated consequences the Emperor had chosen not to see. Loyalty that existed only because alternatives were forbidden. Stability that depended on silence. Unity held together by fear rather than trust. These were not foundations, they were pressure points. And pressure always seeks release. When that release came, it was catastrophic. The structures designed to enforce order became amplifiers of collapse. The secrecy meant to protect humanity turned confusion into panic. The obedience meant to ensure unity fractured into blind fanaticism on one side and bitter defiance on the other. There was no shared understanding to fall back on, only doctrine and resentment. And doctrine cannot adapt when reality changes. The Emperor's greatest failure was not that his plan went wrong. It was that his plan left no room for humanity to respond when it did. He had positioned himself as the single point of stability, the irreplaceable pillar holding civilization upright. But systems built around one pillar do not bend, they shatter. When that pillar weakened, even slightly, everything dependent on it began to collapse at once. Not gradually, not gracefully, all at once. And in that collapse, the true cost of his certainty was revealed. Humanity was not prepared to think for itself. It was not equipped to question, to adapt, to choose. It had been trained to obey. So when obedience no longer provided answers, confusion filled the void. Fear surged back stronger than ever. And the Imperium responded the only way it knew how, by tightening control even further. This is the cruel irony of the Emperor's legacy. The more his vision failed, the more violently it was enforced. Not because it was working, but because admitting failure was unthinkable. At that stage, the system no longer existed to protect humanity. Humanity existed to sustain the system. And this is where the question of evil becomes unavoidable. Not because the Emperor desired suffering, but because he built a reality where suffering was the default response to any problem. A reality where compassion had no authority, where mercy had no mechanism, where humanity's survival demanded its own erosion. What remained was a civilization alive in body, but hollow in spirit. The Emperor sought to guide humanity into a perfect future. Instead, he left it trapped in an endless present, one defined by obedience, fear, and the lingering shadow of a ruler who never allowed himself to be questioned. So when we finally ask whether the Emperor was evil, the answer is not simple. He was not a tyrant driven by hatred. He was not a monster craving destruction. He was something far more unsettling. A being who believed that only he could save humanity, and was willing to sacrifice everything else to prove it. And perhaps that is the final tragedy. Not that humanity suffered under his rule, but that it was never allowed to become anything without it. This is where the question comes full circle, not with certainty, but with discomfort. Because by now, it should be clear that judging the Emperor is not about deciding whether he was a hero or a villain. It is about confronting what happens when power, fear, and conviction merge into something unquestionable. The Emperor did not see himself as evil. That much is certain. In his own mind, every sacrifice was justified, every silence was necessary, every life spent was an investment in a future only he believed he could secure. And that belief is what makes his legacy so difficult to escape. Because intentions do not erase consequences. And salvation built on endless suffering does not become virtuous simply because it was planned. If evil were defined only by cruelty, the Emperor might escape the label. He did not delight in pain. He did not rule through madness or impulse. But if evil can also exist as indifference, if it can emerge from certainty, from the refusal to question oneself, from the belief that others must be controlled for their own good, then the answer becomes far more troubling. The Emperor removed humanity's right to fail in order to prevent it from falling. He stripped away choice to guarantee survival. He replaced growth with obedience and called it unity. And in doing so, he ensured that humanity would endure, but never truly live on its own terms. So was he evil, or was he the final consequence of humanity's fear, fear of chaos, fear of extinction, fear of trusting itself? Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the Emperor did not impose his rule alone. Humanity accepted it, relied on it, still relies on it, because facing a harsh, controlling protector is easier than facing an uncertain future without one. And as long as that remains true, his legacy continues, not as a single being on a throne, but as an idea that refuses to die. An idea that says, safety matters more than freedom, that obedience matters more than understanding, that survival is worth any cost. And once a civilization accepts that idea, it no longer needs a tyrant to enforce it. It enforces itself. So the real question was never just how evil the Emperor truly was. The real question is whether humanity would choose anything different, if given the chance again. By now, we can see the pattern emerging. The Emperor's decisions were not chaotic. They were not emotional. They were deliberate, calculated, and unwavering. And that is what makes them so terrifying. Because evil, when justified, becomes invisible. It wears the face of reason, the voice of necessity, and the patience of inevitability. And when it is cloaked in purpose, even those who suffer under it cannot recognize it for what it truly is. The Emperor's greatest flaw was not cruelty, it was certainty. Absolute, unshakable, unyielding certainty that his vision for humanity was the only one worth pursuing. Every action, every command, every suppression of dissent flowed from this single conviction. In his mind, compromise was not only unnecessary, it was dangerous. Mercy was a distraction, empathy a liability, questioning was the enemy, and obedience was the shield that kept the galaxy alive. Yet there is a subtle distinction that often gets overlooked: certainty can justify almost anything. When one believes completely in the righteousness of their purpose, moral boundaries blur. Entire populations can be sacrificed in the name of survival. Worlds can be stripped, cultures erased, entire generations reshaped, and all of it can be called necessary. And so the emperor did not need to commit evil intentionally. He only needed to act as though his vision alone was correct. And that alone created the conditions for atrocities on a scale almost unimaginable. The monsters of history are usually recognized by their rage or their malice. The emperor was different. He was composed, calculating, calm, and that calm, more than any weapon or war, made his actions unassailable. Because who can argue with inevitability? Who can oppose someone who believes, without doubt, that the suffering they inflict is not suffering at all, but a step toward salvation? And here lies the deepest horror. Those who survived under his rule often became complicit. Not out of desire, but out of necessity. When every choice is framed as survival, resistance becomes dangerous. Questioning becomes heresy. And gradually, the entire galaxy becomes trained to accept suffering as part of the natural order. In this way, evil spreads not through hatred, but through reasoning. It becomes normalized, invisible, and unchallengeable. This is the lesson few dare to admit. Evil does not need to shout to be effective. It does not require cruelty to be enduring. All it needs is a justification, delivered calmly, rationally, and with unwavering certainty. And in that sense, the emperor perfected a form of evil more enduring than any war, any plague, or any rebellion, the quiet, invisible tyranny of conviction. So when we finally return to the question, how evil is the emperor really? The answer is more unsettling than simple judgment. He may not have sought suffering, but he created a reality where suffering became inevitable. He may not have craved destruction, but he designed a system where destruction was necessary. And he may not have been malicious, but his indifference to the consequences of absolute certainty is a lesson in how calm, reasoned conviction can become something far darker than rage ever could. And perhaps, the most frightening truth of all is this: once evil is justified, no one is safe, not the innocent, not the loyal, not even the faithful. Because when morality is replaced by certainty, every action, no matter how reasoned, carries the potential to destroy. By now, it is clear that the story of the emperor is not one of simple villainy or heroism. It is the story of consequences, consequences that ripple through time, space, and every mind under his dominion. Every act he committed, every life he measured, every secret he kept was justified by a single belief, that only he could safeguard humanity's future. And yet, in claiming that authority, he reshaped what it meant to be human. He removed freedom in exchange for survival. He replaced empathy with efficiency. He demanded devotion without demonstrating care. And in doing so, he created a civilization that lives but rarely thrives. One that obeys but rarely questions. One that endures but rarely remembers how to hope. The Imperium exists today not only because of his genius, but because of the immense cost he demanded, and the price humanity was willing, or compelled, to pay. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not the emperor himself, but the dependence he engineered. Humanity learned to accept control as protection, obedience as safety, and silence as wisdom. The cost of survival became normalized. Pain became invisible. And the very people he sought to save were rendered incapable of defining their own destiny. The emperor's legacy forces a question upon anyone who dares to look closer: can morality survive in the presence of absolute power? Can survival ever justify the erasure of choice? Can a civilization truly endure if it has forgotten what it means to be free? And in the end, there are no simple answers. The emperor may not have been evil in the traditional sense. He may have believed in the righteousness of his vision. But the consequences of unwavering certainty, of power exercised without accountability, and of control justified as necessity, these consequences echo across millennia, leaving humanity to live in a world shaped by both salvation and suffering. The story does not end with a clear villain or a triumphant hero. It ends with questions, unease, and reflection. The emperor's actions may have been intended to protect, but they also teach a darker lesson, that even the most calculated, rational intentions can produce consequences that feel indistinguishable from evil. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is this: the emperor's legacy continues, not merely in the empire he built, but in the fear, obedience, and quiet complicity he instilled in humanity itself. So, when we finally ask ourselves how evil the emperor really was, the answer is both simple and impossible. He was not evil by intent, but he became a force whose certainty inflicted suffering beyond measure. And in that, the line between savior and tyrant becomes impossible to trace. For 10,000 years, humanity has lived beneath the shadow of a single name, spoken with reverence, whispered with fear, and never questioned aloud. The Emperor. To most, he is not merely a ruler or a figure of history, but an absolute truth. The reason humanity still exists. The final wall between survival and extinction. From birth, people are taught that everything they have, every breath, every moment of fragile safety, was bought by his will. To doubt him is not curiosity. It is heresy. And heresy, in this galaxy, is worse than death. The Emperor is presented as perfection made manifest. The strongest mind to ever exist. The greatest strategist, scientist, and visionary humanity has ever known. He did what no one else could. He unified a shattered species, dragged it out of barbarism, and gave it a future among the stars. This is the story everyone knows. This is the story everyone is required to know. Statues depict him as radiant and unbreakable, a being beyond human weakness. Texts describe him as patient, wise, and infinitely compassionate, yet capable of infinite wrath when humanity's survival demanded it. In this version of reality, every terrible act committed in his name is not cruelty, but necessity. But necessity is a word that hides sharp edges. Because if the Emperor is truly perfect, if his intentions are pure and his vision flawless, then why is questioning him forbidden? Why is doubt treated as a contagion rather than a conversation? Why must belief be enforced with fear, punishment, and erasure? These are not questions encouraged by the Imperium. These are questions that vanish people. From the very beginning, the Emperor did not ask humanity to follow him. He decided it would. His arrival was not a negotiation but a declaration. A galaxy in ruins, a species fractured by war, superstition, and betrayal, and a single figure who believed only he could fix it. In that moment, the fate of trillions was placed into the hands of one mind. Not by consent, but by inevitability. Because when someone possesses unmatched power, resistance stops being an option and becomes a delay. To the desperate, he was salvation. To the tired, he was order. To the fearful, he was certainty. Humanity did not kneel because it loved him, it knelt because it was exhausted. And exhaustion makes people grateful for chains, as long as those chains promise safety. The Emperor understood this better than anyone. He understood that people do not need freedom when they are afraid. They need answers. Simple ones. Strong ones. He offered unity in place of chaos, obedience in place of confusion, and faith in place of doubt. But it was a carefully controlled faith. Not one born of spiritual comfort, but one shaped like a command. Believe, because believing keeps you alive. Obey, because obedience is survival. Question nothing, because questions fracture unity, and unity, above all else, must be preserved. And so humanity learned to stop asking why. The Imperium teaches that before the Emperor, there was only darkness. Endless war, endless suffering, that every world he conquered, every culture he erased, every ideology he burned away was already doomed. That resistance to him was resistance to survival itself. In this narrative, the Emperor did not destroy civilizations, he spared them prolonged suffering. He did not silence opposition, he prevented collapse. He did not rule with fear, he ruled with necessity. But necessity does not mourn its victims. Trillions have lived and died without ever seeing the Emperor as anything other than a distant symbol. A corpse on a throne. A god machine keeping the darkness at bay. To them, morality is irrelevant. If his continued existence prevents annihilation, then any cost is acceptable. This is the bargain the Imperium makes every day. Not because it is just, but because it is simple. And simplicity is comforting when the universe is trying to kill you. Yet even comfort has consequences. Because the moment morality becomes conditional, it stops being morality at all. It becomes arithmetic. Lives weighed against outcomes. Suffering measured against efficiency. Entire populations reduced to numbers in a calculation only one being was ever allowed to solve. The Emperor did not merely claim authority over humanity's future. He claimed authority over its conscience. And once that happened, evil no longer needed to announce itself. The most unsettling thing about the Emperor is not the wars fought in his name, or the oceans of blood spilled to build his empire. War is loud, obvious, easy to condemn. What should trouble us is how quiet his rule became afterward. How efficiently violence was normalized. How suffering was reframed as duty. How entire generations were raised believing that pain was proof of righteousness. Because truly evil systems do not rely on monsters. They rely on belief. The Emperor never asked to be loved. Love is unpredictable. Love questions. Love demands reciprocity. Instead, he cultivated something far more reliable: reverence. Reverence does not ask why. It asks how much. How much can be sacrificed? How much can be endured? How much humanity can lose before it becomes something else entirely? And still, the galaxy insists he is good. Perhaps because the alternative is unbearable. If the Emperor is not good, then everything built upon him is rotten. Every prayer is hollow. Every sacrifice meaningless. Every death unnecessary. And if that is true, then humanity has not been saved. It has been trapped in a nightmare it is too afraid to wake up from. So the question is never asked publicly. It lingers only in the silence between sanctioned truths. It hides in the hesitation before obedience. It trembles in the minds of those who glimpse the cracks and look away quickly, because seeing too much is dangerous. But it is a question that refuses to die. Not because it is heretical, but because it is human. Just how evil is the Emperor really? And what does it say about us, that we are terrified to find out? If you stay with this story until the very end, you'll uncover a truth most never dared to face. A realization that completely reshapes how the Emperor's legacy should be judged, and why humanity may have paid a price far greater than extinction itself. The Imperium teaches that perfection demands sacrifice. Not symbolic sacrifice. Not temporary hardship. But real, irreversible loss measured in cities, cultures, and entire worlds. From the moment unity was declared necessary, humanity was no longer treated as a collection of individuals, but as raw material. Lives became currency. Pain became policy. And death became a tool, wielded without hesitation in the name of a future only one being claimed to understand. The Emperor did not merely conquer humanity's enemies. He conquered humanity itself. He stripped away identities that did not fit his vision and labeled them weaknesses. Traditions that resisted standardization were erased. Beliefs that could not be controlled were burned. Entire populations vanished, not because they were malicious, but because they were inefficient. And efficiency, under his rule, was elevated above compassion. This is where the idea of necessary evil first took root. The Emperor did not deny the brutality of his actions, he reframed them. Every massacre became prevention. Every extermination became mercy. Every silenced voice became a threat neutralized. The language of salvation was used to justify acts that, under any other ruler, would be called monstrous. But words matter. When cruelty is renamed necessity, people stop seeing it as cruelty at all. The most chilling part is not that the Emperor made these choices, but that humanity accepted them. Fear makes people pragmatic. Desperation makes them obedient. When extinction looms, moral lines blur until they disappear entirely. And the Emperor stood at the center of that fear, offering survival at a price few dared to calculate. Because to calculate it honestly would mean admitting how much was lost along the way. Entire planets were sacrificed without hesitation. Billions died so that trillions might live. But this logic carries a quiet poison. Once lives become numbers, there is no natural stopping point. There is always another acceptable loss. Another population deemed expendable. Another atrocity justified by the promise of a safer tomorrow. And over time, the promise matters less than the habit. The Imperium did not become cruel overnight. It became efficient. It learned to kill without anger, to destroy without hatred, and to move on without reflection. This was the Emperor's greatest success, not the wars he won, but the mindset he normalized. A civilization trained to believe that suffering was not a failure of leadership, but proof that leadership was working. And yet, beneath the rigid logic of survival, a quiet contradiction emerges. If humanity required endless sacrifice to be saved, then what exactly was being saved? A species stripped of empathy. A civilization held together by fear and obedience. Survival alone does not define goodness. Endurance is not morality. And a future built on uncountable graves carries a weight that cannot be ignored forever. This is the cost of perfection no one likes to discuss. Because once you acknowledge it, the Emperor's image begins to fracture. He is no longer just a protector standing against the dark, but a figure willing to create darkness of his own, as long as it served his design. Not out of hatred, not out of rage, but out of certainty. And certainty, when unchecked, is one of the most dangerous forces in existence. So as the Imperium marches on, repeating the same justifications again and again, one uncomfortable truth remains buried beneath doctrine and devotion. The line between salvation and cruelty was crossed so long ago that no one remembers where it was supposed to be. And perhaps the most disturbing realization of all is this: humanity did not merely endure these sacrifices, it learned to depend on them. Stay with this section, and you'll begin to see why silence, not war, became the Emperor's most powerful weapon, and why ignorance was never an accident but a design choice. Control does not begin with armies. It begins with information. The Emperor understood that humanity's greatest weakness was not disunity, but curiosity. Questions lead to doubt. Doubt leads to fracture. And fracture invites collapse. So instead of trusting humanity with the full truth, he chose to ration it. Carefully, strategically. What people were allowed to know was filtered through necessity, stripped of nuance, and shaped into something safe. Something manageable. Something that would not threaten the stability of his vision. Knowledge, under his rule, was no longer a shared inheritance, it was a privilege. A weapon. And like all weapons, it was locked away from those deemed unworthy to wield it. The Emperor believed that humanity could not be trusted with reality as it truly was. That the truth of the universe, its horrors, its contradictions, its forces beyond reason, would break the fragile order he had constructed. And so he chose omission over honesty. Silence over explanation. He did not lie outright. He simply decided what humanity did not need to know. And in doing so, he positioned himself as the sole arbiter of truth. This is where control deepened into something far more unsettling. Because when knowledge is restricted, consent becomes impossible. You cannot choose freely if the choices are hidden from you. Humanity did not agree to the Emperor's vision. They were guided into it, blindfolded, told that the path was the only one that existed. Alternatives were erased not because they failed, but because they challenged his authority to decide alone. Those who sought answers outside approved doctrine were not debated. They were removed. Not always violently, but completely. Records vanished. Names were erased. Entire histories were rewritten or sealed away. And over time, humanity learned the lesson without needing to be told. Curiosity is dangerous. Understanding is risky. Survival belongs to those who do not ask too much. The most terrifying aspect of this system is how reasonable it sounded. After all, ignorance kept people calm. Calm kept them obedient. Obedience kept the Imperium functioning. And the Imperium functioning meant humanity survived another day. The logic is airtight, if you accept the premise that survival is the only value that matters. But once that premise is accepted, anything can be justified. Even the slow suffocation of the human mind. The emperor did not rule through chaos or terror alone. He ruled through stability, predictability, the quiet comfort of routine. People knew their place. They knew what was expected of them. And most importantly, they knew which thoughts were forbidden. This was not a failure of governance. It was its success. Because a population trained not to question does not need constant enforcement. It polices itself. And yet, buried beneath layers of obedience and ritual, cracks began to form. Because truth has a way of leaking through, no matter how tightly it is sealed. Whispers spread. Contradictions surfaced. Loyal servants noticed that the official explanations never quite aligned with reality. That the emperor's silence on certain matters was not protective, but deliberate. Calculated. And once someone realizes they are being kept in the dark, a dangerous thought follows. If the truth would destroy unity, what kind of unity was it to begin with? The emperor may have believed that secrecy was mercy. That humanity was too fragile to bear the weight of the universe. But in making that choice, he ensured that humanity would never grow beyond its dependence on him. He did not prepare mankind to face the truth. He made sure it would never have to. Or never be allowed to. Because a species that understands its reality can choose its future. A species kept ignorant can only follow. And the emperor preferred followers. This is where the emperor stops feeling like a distant god and begins to feel uncomfortably human, not in warmth, but in failure. Because power does not only shape empires. It shapes relationships, and the way a ruler treats those closest to him often reveals more than how he treats his enemies. The emperor did not surround himself with equals. He created instruments. Brilliant, powerful, carefully designed beings meant to carry out his will across a hostile galaxy. They were given strength beyond measure, intelligence far surpassing ordinary humans, and a singular purpose: serve the emperor's vision without hesitation. To them, he was not just a commander. He was a father, or at least, that is what they were encouraged to believe. But fatherhood implies responsibility beyond utility. From the very beginning, the emperor's bond with his creations was conditional. Loyalty was rewarded. Doubt was not tolerated. Affection, when it appeared, was distant and measured, never enough to soften the reality that they were tools first, sons second. If a creation fulfilled its purpose, it was valued. If it deviated, it was corrected. And if correction failed, it was discarded. This dynamic planted the seeds of tragedy long before any open conflict emerged. Because beings raised on conditional approval do not seek understanding, they seek validation. They crave acknowledgement that never fully comes. And when that acknowledgement is withheld, resentment festers in the silence. The emperor did not notice this, or perhaps he did and dismissed it as irrelevant. Emotions, after all, were inefficient. And inefficiency had no place in his grand design. He expected absolute loyalty without offering trust. He demanded obedience without transparency. He insisted on devotion without vulnerability. In doing so, he created followers who would die for him, but never truly know him. And that distance proved fatal. Not because they lacked strength, but because they lacked clarity. A leader who refuses to explain his choices invites interpretation. And interpretation, left unchecked, becomes suspicion. The emperor believed his creations were strong enough to endure ignorance. That they did not need the full truth to serve effectively. But strength without understanding is unstable. Power without context is dangerous. And loyalty built on silence eventually collapses under the weight of unanswered questions. When fractures appeared, the emperor responded not with reflection, but with control. He tightened restrictions, deepened secrecy, pulled further away. The more uncertainty grew, the more distant he became. And in that widening gap, trust withered. Not because his followers stopped believing, but because belief without explanation becomes fragile. This is where the story turns from inevitability to tragedy. Because the emperor had countless opportunities to speak, to clarify, to acknowledge fear and confusion, to treat those closest to him as partners rather than instruments. But doing so would have required something he never allowed himself to display: doubt. And doubt, to the Emperor, was weakness. So instead of healing the fractures, he reinforced the system that caused them. A system where authority replaced communication, where obedience replaced understanding, where love was implied but never proven. And when the breaking point finally came, it was not betrayal born of malice but of abandonment. Those who turned away did not do so because they hated the Emperor. They did so because they felt unseen, unheard, untrusted. They were powerful beyond measure, yet treated as liabilities rather than individuals. And in that contradiction, loyalty shattered. This is the quiet horror of the Emperor's legacy. He was capable of shaping the destiny of humanity, but incapable of sustaining the relationships that destiny depended on. He believed that vision alone was enough. That emotion was a distraction. That purpose outweighed connection. But empires are not held together by purpose alone. They are held together by trust. And trust, once broken, does not need enemies to collapse. This is the moment where intention and outcome finally collide. Where the grand vision that justified everything begins to unravel under the weight of its own certainty. Because the Emperor did not lack foresight, he lacked humility. And that flaw, more than any external threat, shaped the fate of everything that followed. From the beginning, the Emperor believed he alone could see the full shape of the future. Not fragments, not possibilities, the path. To him, humanity was a species standing at the edge of annihilation, and hesitation was the true enemy. Every decision he made was filtered through a single belief: there was no room for error. And when someone believes error is unacceptable, they stop questioning their own conclusions. The Emperor did not plan for failure, he denied its possibility. This is where the lie took root. Not a lie spoken aloud, but a quiet assumption repeated until it hardened into truth. That his vision was not just the best option, but the only option. That alternatives were not merely inferior, but dangerous. That disagreement itself posed an existential risk. And once that belief settled in, every act of control became justified, not because it worked, but because it came from him.